Thank you for watching this video from the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue at Carleton University. This event is sponsored by the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, CETD, and the Faculty of Public Affairs Research Month at Carleton University. CETD receives funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the CETD, SSHRC, or Carleton University.
Welcome everybody to the second last panel. For the afternoon, my name is Schmidtke, and I had the pleasure of leading the migration research group over the past 7 years now. And my challenging task is to keep you entertained and awake before dinner and probably your first beer for the day. I'm sure with this kind of panel, we shouldn't have any challenge in this respect. So when we planned this session, it was hard to predict in a way the events that we see at the moment in Europe, and maybe for a Canadian audience, it's hard to imagine to what degree the current refugee crisis has overtaken also the news and the imagination of the European publics. Here in the Canadian context, we speak about crisis proportion when 10,000, 25,000 refugees need to be housed and settled in a place like Vancouver. In a place like Germany, at some stage, 10,000 refugees came on one day alone, just giving you a sense of the urgency of the problem and the perception. And in a way, I think you will hear a lot about the current refugee crisis and what it means for governing migration more broadly. But I still hope that we can get in some of those issues that we've been struggling with in terms of the Europe-Canada comparison over the past couple of years. And let me just highlight two of the challenges, or maybe even paradoxes, that are highlighted by the current refugee crisis. The first one is the question, at which level of government do you address issues of governing migration? And it is clearly, as we heard this morning, the issue of refugee now is a global phenomenon, a global issue, or if you want, a European one. It is very hard to imagine, to see individual nation states having the sole authority over this. And there's a good reason why the European Union over the past 25 years has gradually given substance to a European migration and refugee law, because it is an issue that with the Schengen Agreement, with internal mobility, you need to address at the supranational level. At the same time, some of the issues related to settlement, integration, and so forth almost and invariably need to be addressed at the local level, in municipalities, on the ground. So we will hear a little bit about both today in terms of the internationalization, in terms of governing migration, and how they can best be addressed in systems, and that's another key term we heard this morning, systems of multi-level governments. On the other hand, you also see, and this is what unfolds at the moment in Europe, that once the nation state is challenged in this key area of sovereign rights, the control over borders, the control over who gets in, who gets out, who gets a passport, these are genuine issues that traditionally were handled by individual nation state. And there's a lot of pushback against allowing different levels of governments taking over these kind of tasks. We have seen a decentralization here in the Canadian context with provinces taking over gradually more and more influence of this. In the European context, we see at the moment a pushback against exactly this kind of development. The second paradox, before I hand it over to our panel, is the political dynamic that we see unfold at the moment. On the one hand, Europe needs urgently the influx of high numbers of immigrants to deal with its demographic change, aging societies. It has to a certain degree followed the example of Canada in terms of at least thinking about and starting to build recruitment schemes, in particular for skilled migrants. So in this respect, Canada, with its point system, with its recruitment strategy, has been an example and a blueprint for what's unfolding in the European context. But at the very same time, and this is a paradox, there is a political pushback against the increase in more expensive and liberal immigration regimes. That's what we see at the moment with respect to the refugee crisis, that we see a resurgence in extreme and exclusivist forms of nationalism, the rise of the populist right across the European continent. And we could push this and also address what this means for European integration, because two of the fundamental achievements of European integration are at risk, at least at the moment. One is the collective action capacity of the European Union, cost sharing, addressing key issues in solidarity with each other. That's really on the line. The Dublin Agreement seems to be, a matter of only exists on paper anymore. And the other one is cross-border mobility. This is one of the key achievements of the European Union over the past 50 years. There are now border controls reinstated at various national borders across the European Union. And we see, well, this will be reversed, but it might actually be at least a fundamental challenge to one of the key principles of European integration. This having said, I'm really happy to introduce our panel today. And you have the CVs in front of you, but just very briefly from your right, I'm delighted that Andrew Geddes has joined us, an eminent scholar in migration policy in Europe. He is a professor at Sheffield University, and he has just been, or maybe a year ago, won a major grant from the European Research Council, Prospect for International Migration Governments. Probably they didn't know how busy it would be, with the current events in Europe, with your idea. So we're delighted to have you here and join us. Elke Winter, who's also on the program, has fallen victim to the flu season, so she won't be able to join us this afternoon. And Howard Duncan is next on the panel. Howard has been the chief executive and head of Metropolis. This is an organization, for those of you who don't know, whose mandate it is to bring together, very much in terms of what we're doing here, researchers, frontline workers, policymakers. Over a period of, it's now almost 20 years now, Metropolis has done this, an excellent job. And from my perspective as a scholar, I can only tell Howard, how does we socialize the whole generation of young researchers and graduate students into the field of migration studies in the Canadian, but also in the international context. Last but not least, we have Agnieszka Weinar here, who is also joining us from Europe, although it's kind of, you're already here in Ottawa because she has a dual identity in terms of professional background. She is housed at the European University Institute in Florence. At the same time, she's here with a prestigious Marie Curie Fellowship at Carleton and at Metropolis jointly, right? And she told me she is, gradually moving towards Canada. So we discussed this in terms of a more personal convergence between Europe and Canada. We